All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Real Crusades History live stream. We are back with another interview. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Helena Schroeder. Helena, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. Nice to be here as usual.
All right, great to have you. And Helen and I are joined by a very noteworthy scholar, Dr. Adrian Boas, and he's joining us from Israel right now. Dr. Boas, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to join in.
Yeah, it's really great to have you. I know that Helen and I have been following your blog and your research, and a lot of this stuff has been posted on the Real Crusades History Facebook group, and people have been really interested in your work. So it's great to get to talk to you about some of this stuff. So let's start off by talking about some of your background with archaeology. So, what was it that attracted you to archaeology in the first place?
Well, I suppose it was an attraction since childhood, really, for tangible evidence of the past, holding something in your hand. I grew up in Australia, a country with a very short recorded history, and growing up, I never heard of archaeology at all. But I remember the excitement, for example, of finding coins with portraits of George V when I was cutting the lawn, or at the age of 16 going into town with a friend to look for the old buildings in the city, which didn't date to before the mid-19th century. So the interest was there, the seeds of the interest were there from fairly early on. And of course, coming to Israel, an ancient land with a very long history, which I did with my family in 1969, was a tremendous eye-opener. Archaeology is so much a part of life here. And in fact, when I started my university studies, I was living next to an archaeological site, large Byzantine monastery. So really it would have been hard for me to avoid developing an interest. Though I don't think I thought of it as a career move until when I was in the university and studying, and I'd actually intended to study modern European history. And I took archaeology as a secondary field, but I think the interest in the tangible won over. And of course, once I attended an archaeological dig, I was hooked.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I know that a lot of our time gets spent looking at these chronicles and these primary sources, but yeah, that's pretty compelling. That idea of this tangible aspect of history that we can dig up in the ground and find this really solid evidence for these things. So what was it that got you interested in the Latin East in particular, like the Crusades? I mean, obviously, like you're saying, there's so much to choose from in terms of history when we're looking at a region like Israel. I mean, it's just immense variety and depth of history there. But how did the Crusades in particular become of interest to you?
Well, I think two things really. One was once again from my childhood when I was about 10 or 11, I suppose. I read a book about the Middle Ages called Nicholas and the Woolpack, if I recall. I think it was the author's name was Cynthia Harnett. Maybe you've heard of her or of the book. It was about life in medieval England through the eyes of a boy probably not much older than I was, and it generated an interest in two fields really, in archaeology, or because there were a lot of descriptions of daily life and of objects and so forth, and of course of the medieval period, and I think so that was sort of the interest in the Middle Ages was there from childhood. But the choice specifically of the Crusader period was really when I went to university and took classes. I was fortunate enough to study under one of the great scholars of crusading history of the Latin East, Joshua Prava. And he was a tremendous teacher with a wealth of knowledge and the ability to make it fascinating through the use of stories, anecdotes, and humor. And it really inspired me. And it was almost as if he had a personal relationship with the people he was discussing. So taking a couple of his courses was really really directed me in that direction of moving over into the Middle Ages rather than continuing on the original plan of studying modern history. And also, it was my good fortune that he sent me on to do my master's studies under a former student of his, another important scholar of the period, Benjamin Kedar. So through this, I gained a very deep interest in the Crusader period and became aware of the fact also that in Israel, although there's a very prominent presence of Crusader ruins throughout the country, there were no archaeologists at the time who took a full-time interest in the Crusader period. So I realized this was also an area that I could make my own mark in. So I mean, obviously, biblical and classical archaeology are fields which are pretty crowded. So I think these were the things that directed me in that particular direction of medieval period and the Crusades. And the more I got into it, the more deeply attracted to it I became. Because there was the downside: there were no lectures in the university on Crusader archaeology. There were on Crusader history, but no archaeology and no mentors, nobody to guide me. So, but on the other hand, there were these excellent historians there. So, this is where the attraction to the Crusader period came from. So primarily through my teachers.
So, what would you? Oh yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
Would you mind if I butt in with a question here? What about Ronnie? What about Ronnie Ellenblum? I mean, what's your relationship with him? And because he's obviously also been very, very active. Is he one of your students or colleagues?
No. So we're a colleague, definitely. Ronnie is, I think he's a year younger than I am, or something like that. But he actually started university before I did, and he studied also under the same teachers. So we met. I think we met in classes of Joshua Prouder's classes, and Benjamin Kedar, who was my mentor from my MA and PhD, was also his. So we were colleagues, and then we worked together on an archaeological excavation that he organized. So we became for 3 years. So we were quite closely related in our work, and also obviously the fields are overlapping. So I mean, there was a lot of things he was dealing with that were of particular interest to me, and presumably vice versa. So colleagues.
And has the number of, or has the interest in the Crusader period increased? Are there more people studying? Are you offering courses in Crusader archaeology at this point?
Yes, I started teaching at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Crusader archaeology, and since then, and subsequently into other universities, and most of my career I've been teaching Crusader archaeology and history in the University of Haifa. I live in Jerusalem, but I teach in Haifa, and I've had several students who have gone on to become doctors of Crusader archaeology. So there is a growing number of scholars in Israel working in the field, whereas, as I said before, when I started, there were absolutely none. There was nobody teaching in the field. So there are people working in the Israel Antiquities Authority whose expertise is in Crusader archaeology, and they are my former students. So there is a body of people, of scholars working in the field today, which wasn't the case in the past. So there's an improvement. I wouldn't say it's ideal. It's a very small number of scholars still, because the interest in the overwhelming interest in archaeology in Israel relates to the biblical and classical periods and the connection between the Jewish people and the Holy Land. So there's the fields of Islamic archaeology and certainly Crusader archaeology have always sort of been left behind. But it definitely is a much better situation today than it was when I started out.
Okay. Great, thank you very much.
Okay, good questions from Helena. So I think one thing that we're really starting to get on here is this idea of daily life and what archaeology can tell us about that. And I think that's one of the things that when we're students of history, we're really interested in that, and maybe the chronicles sometimes can kind of leave us wanting more in that area, maybe. So I don't know, Dr. Boas, what has archaeology been able to show us about daily life in the Crusader states? I know one thing that Helena was interested in us looking at is clothing, like what was the typical dress like? To what extent did the Franks adopt that? And I know that's kind of a wide open question, but I just wanted to see where you would go with it.
Well, I think archaeology has enabled us to get a much broader picture of life in the Latin East, not just with regard to dress, but with many other aspects of daily life. And I mean, the frequently quoted passage in Fulch of Chartres about the Occidentals who become Orientals, and the harsh criticisms that were placed on the local Frankish population by the Bishop of Acre, Jacques de Vitry, and others, are evidence of how the local population, the Frankish population in the Latin East, had the ability and desire to adapt, to adopt, to introduce things from their past, and to bring them together, to synthesize them, and to create something new. And this is something which is evident in almost every aspect of certainly of archaeological finds. And I'll give you a few examples of this sort of movement towards a new sort of hybrid lifestyle, if you like. In fortifications, obviously, the construction of city walls and gates and fortresses, we find the Franks are imitating not only what they see in Muslim ruins, which themselves have imitated, say, Roman and Iron Age layout of fortresses, but have adopted things also from Armenian architecture, from Byzantine models, complex gateways, the use of machicolation, those openings above gateways where you dropped rocks or poured boiling water. And this is an aspect of Islamic architecture which was adopted into fortifications by the Franks. If you take, for example, rural settlement, this is something I worked in quite a lot, excavating and also writing on. The Franks brought from their own background, from the West, the street village plan, a single street with houses either side, and then elongated plots of land extending out beyond the houses. And this was a typical medieval European layout, and they introduced it into the Middle Eastern landscape, but they constructed these villages using Eastern type construction methods. So you have a combination of Western design, Eastern construction, with sometimes Western elements of decoration. In domestic building, which is another area that I've worked in extensively, including a book that I wrote on the topic.
Which I own. I love it. Have it as a reference on my shelf.
Well, it was a lot of fun to do, and I think it's a very useful book because it's something that nobody had dealt with at all before, about the houses. I mean, fortifications and churches had always been an area which scholars have been interested in, but sort of left the houses behind. And there are actually so many examples. And in these houses, you'll see the same thing. You'll see it in the way they have adopted sometimes a layout from Islam. So you'll have a typical Muslim courtyard house with all its typical elements, indirect access into the courtyard, and from the courtyard into the apartments, and no windows on the ground floor. So exactly like a Muslim house, but it'll be built using Western masonry techniques, for example. Or you'll have in the port cities Italian type merchant palaces and tower houses. So this sort of adaptation, synthesis, and you'll find it in things like the use of, or the frequent use of the bathhouse by the Franks, and adoption of when they constructed bathhouses, of the Muslim or Islamic model of the bathhouse rather than the classical one. Or you can find it, for example, in the coins they used, imitating the gold dinar, Fatima dinar, in the coin, the local bezant, which was the Frankish coin, with Arabic text and Islamic text in Arabic script, but minted by the Franks. And you'll see it in weapons and armor. In dress, it's a bit more difficult because there's comparatively little archaeological evidence. In Montford, we find buttons and buckles, and they found a shoe in the past, and fragments of cloth, but very little. And the written sources are actually perhaps more useful than the archaeological sources in specifically with regard to dress. In the written sources, there are, for example, in the rules of the military orders, there's a lot of references to dress, and although they refer to what the brothers of the order would be wearing, the restrictions give us a sense of what people outside of the monastery were wearing. So you do get a sense of that through text, but not so much through archaeological evidence. There are many other aspects in rural life, agricultural techniques that were adopted.
Like adopted from Eastern techniques?
From the East or from the West. For example, in the West, in the Middle Ages, there was an extensive use of wheel plows to cut more deeply into the soil, and they were of no use in the rocky countryside in the Latin East, so they readopted the old stick plow that was still in use here. There are numerous other examples.
One of the things I was very impressed with, you said the introduction of chimneys came from the West with the Crusaders. But that was not
from the West. It came, I think it came probably from more in the region of Asia Minor, because although there's a problem with this, we found in a number of large buildings, castles, manor houses, and particularly in the Frankish villages, Western type villages around Jerusalem, a number of wall chimneys and fireplaces. And you don't find them prior to the Crusader period in the Holy Land, and you don't find them after the Crusader period until very late in the Ottoman period in the Holy Land. So they arrived with the Franks, and then the question is really where they came from. And the original expectation was that they came from Europe because fireplaces are so common in Europe. But in fact, there aren't very many examples, except for in very wealthy houses and a little bit later. In Europe, usually you have either movable braziers or some sort of fireplace in the center of the room with an opening in a castle or a large feudal hall. And in private houses, well, they just haven't survived really, because most of the village houses were built of wattle and daub or other perishable materials. So there's not really much evidence, certainly not in the 12th century, which is the date that the examples we have here are from.
Which makes it even more fascinating, because it could indicate that that's something that the Crusaders took back with them to Western Europe.
One of these things that originated in the East, and that very well could be the case. It's a bit hard to say. I mean, you can't say definitely because as I say, we don't have the evidence in the West surviving, but we do have contemporary fireplaces in modern Turkey. So dating from the 12th century, or in Greece. So you do have evidence. So once again, it would be something they might have seen in their relationship with Byzantium, with the Armenians and so forth, and then brought it to the Crusader states, used it there, and then from there it went back, like a number of other things, to Europe and became more known to us as something European rather than Middle Eastern. But maybe it came in that direction.
Fascinating.
Yeah, very interesting. So one of the major sites you've worked on is Montford. What have been some of the most interesting aspects about your research into Montford? What are some things you found there?
That's always a very hard question to answer because there's so much. We began excavating in 2006, and Montford was the main Teutonic fortress in the Latin East. There aren't that many, but it was the principal fortress. And I'd spent two seasons before that, excavating the original Teutonic house in Acre, which we discovered. And it was an excavation funded by the Deutsche Orden, which is the continuation of the Teutonic Order. And we actually found and identified the Teutonic compound in Acre. We were able to identify it by the presence of heraldic symbols of emblems of the order on the ceramics. And so I had this background in Teutonic sites, and when I was looking for a site to excavate, it occurred to me that Montfort hasn't been excavated since 1926, and it's a fascinating site. So I set up a team through Haifa University and employing volunteers from all over the place, actually, from Europe and the United States. And we've been digging there for now 8 seasons. We began in 2006 with a couple of years of surveys to learn about the site, to get a better feel of the site. And then we started excavating, and we excavate virtually every year. And in the summer, usually, this year we'll be doing 2 seasons, one below the castle in a structure below the castle in the valley, and one in the castle itself. And what we've attempted to do is to build on the work that was carried out in 1926, when an expedition from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York was sent out to look for a suit of armor. They were entirely unsuccessful in that. They found a few lumps of corroded chainmail. But what they did find was a lot of evidence for daily life in the castle and from weaponry and so forth. And they also excavated the structure, so they were part of the central part of the structure, so they got an idea of the function of the building. So we've been building on that, and we've done, as I say, 8 seasons in different parts of the castle, trying to get as broad as an understanding of the way the castle developed, of its functions, of events that took place there, of its conquest and its destruction. It was intentionally destroyed or dismantled by the Mamluks in 1271. And so our efforts have been to get as broad a picture of it as possible through moving around to different parts of the fortress and examining them. And for example, our first season was in the Great Hall, the ceremonial hall of the castle, which was a magnificent Gothic structure with rib vaulting and carvings and wall paintings and stained glass windows, and from the fragments that have been found, gilded furnishings as well. And so a very elaborate building, which, as was noted in 1926 in the report that was published a year later, actually 1927, by the museum team. They mentioned the fact that they were disappointed that they didn't find a suit of chainmail, but they were impressed by the evidence for Crusader fortresses living on the edge of Christendom, having garrisons living in great style and luxury. And this is something that has continued to come across through our examination. So ceremonial hall, and afterwards we discovered the stables, and we've examined the wine press and begun to work on the latrine, which is also very important because it can teach you about the diseases and about the food that they were consuming. And we've had a tremendous amount of finds, and also learnt a great deal about the construction, how the castle was constructed, the chronology of its construction, how the different parts of it functioned, what the garrison used, what they ate from, the glass and ceramic vessels, the food through bones and some other vegetable remains that we found, tools and weapons, industries taking place within the castle, wine production, the forge, the bone industry, evidence of their leisure activities, the games of board games and dice, things like that. So it's been pretty consistent. I would say every season that we've excavated, we've had a major discovery of new evidence of these different aspects of life in the castle and the construction of the castle. And as I say, also the conquest and the destruction of the castle, which is very, very prominently evident in the undermining and the burning of the castle remains and so forth. So there's a great deal that we've learned so far, and I mean, it's every year is just another additional advancement in these areas.
Dr. Boas, I know you're very, very cautious and you're hesitant to draw conclusions without more evidence, but would you take a stab at what does this tell us about the lifestyle, that they were still living in a grand style and enjoying board games, but you say actually living in luxury? Was you were saying, the ostrich idea, that they have their head in the sand, they don't realize that the threat is as great as it was? Or how do you interpret the finds, and you know, given as you say that they're actually on the brink of collapse?
Yes, well, I think I mean, you know, from my own experience living in the Middle East, people do tend to get on with life even when things look pretty dire. And I mean, you know, I wrote this in one of my blog posts. You know,
Yes.
people living on the edge of a volcano tend to live normal lives and to get on with life and so forth. So I mean, this is a human trait, and I don't think it's any different in areas where people are living under a potential threat. I mean, living in Israel, obviously, there's always this sense that, you know, things could change very suddenly, but you don't stop living, and you know, I mean, you might be able to see it in some way as burying your head in the sand, but it's a very typical sort of human trait to do this, and I think, you know, I mean, the luxury that you find in sites like Montford or Chevalier and the other big castles is relates, I think, to the possession of these sites by large organizations whose roots are not only in this threatened area.
Of course, their wealth is coming. Yeah, the wealth is coming from the West.
Exactly, the wealth is coming from the West, and also they have extensive holdings in the West, and the Teutonic Order would develop a state of its own in northern Poland, in Prussia. So I mean, you know, there was a risk here, but I mean, there is a lot of evidence on pranks in the Latin East, as you say, you know, sort of the ostrich thing of burying the head in the sand. There is evidence of that, fairly obvious in rural settlement, for example. In the fortresses, I think, yeah, as you say, I'm very cautious.
That's good. That's fine. Steve, Stephen, did you have anything?
Yeah, absolutely. This is just really interesting listening to Dr. Boas talk about this stuff. So in terms of just jumping off that point of how threatened the settlements in the Latin East were, I know when we were talking to Dr. Donaghy about some of this stuff a while back, he kind of suggested some caution about viewing the Latin East as kind of always on the verge of conquest. Really, for a lot of the 13th century, there's sort of a stability there, and you know, a certain defensive strength that the Crusader settlements have, that they're able to kind of maintain themselves. And really, it's kind of the last few decades where things really get dire. What do you think about that, Dr. Boas? Do you think that the Latin East kind of had sort of a pretty strong recovery in the early 13th century that kind of later declined, or do you think it was sort of always on the brink of falling to the Muslims?
Well, I think after the Battle of Hattin and the partial recovery of the Third Crusade, I think there was a degree of stability, and things did improve at times with the agreement of Frederick II and the expansion of the recovery of Jerusalem for a brief period and the expansion into the Galilee, or back into the Galilee. So it wasn't. But once again, it's very volatile. There are the first, I would say, let's say the first 50 years of the kingdom, or the first 3 or 4 decades of the kingdom. Let's put it like that. It's still fairly fragile, and then you have this very stable period from the 40s and onwards. Once Ascalon is first cut off by castles and then eventually occupied in 1153, and the threat which was a major threat, the threat from Ascalon ended, then you have this remarkably intensive settlement outside of the cities, and you've got Franks who were urban dwellers who may have originally been peasants in Europe that had become urban dwellers in the first decades of the 12th century, returning to the land and going and settling in these rural settlements, particularly intensively around Jerusalem, and to a lesser degree, but fairly intensively around Acre, Tyre, Nablus, and other places. And so you'll have this settlement, and you'll have evidence in this phase from, say, the 1150s to 1170, where there's a sense that things have improved greatly and that the internal security is really quite reasonable, and so you'll have settlements which are completely undefended, and street villages with no walls and maybe a tower but nothing else. Rural estate centers, sort of rather like manor houses, built out in the country with no real defenses. They sometimes look very strong but that's more to do with the method of construction, but with no actual military elements in them, no arrow slits and no towers and so forth.
Do we know if these were actual people from Outremer moving out into the rural areas, or were they new settlers? Because
they were both, and we do know this. And yes, there were both. There are documents of the settlement in Bet Gibelin, which is Bet Govrin today. The original name was Bet Govrin, Bet Gibelin to the southwest of Jerusalem, and other places like some of the villages around Jerusalem, and Achziv in the north, Kassel in Bel, where you have documents, and the documents list names, and from the names you learn that so and so came from Ramle or from Jerusalem, but somebody else came from Poitiers or someplace in France. So you get lists of names, and names often having the surnames often being the place where they originated from. So we know that these settlers were both Franks, local Franks, and new immigrants from or perhaps people who retained their original name, even though they'd been settled in the east. But there definitely were Eastern Franks settling in these villages.
And this brings me to, I guess, something which is really sort of occupying me right now, and that is the Cyprus. Do we have similar records for Cyprus of settlements and who home? Because we have the situation that in the 13th century, many of the lords, at least in the Latin East, had fiefs in Cyprus, but they never used them as their names. They continued to call themselves Ibelin and Tiberius and Haifa and all the other names. They continued to use their old titles, which were, I guess, the senior titles, while at the same time holding fiefs from the King of Cyprus. And some of those estates must have been very, very large, based on the kind of, John of Joffre being able to have his galley all fitted out with, enough, I don't know what we saw, glory to impress even Jean de Joinville. And so it makes me think that there's an awful lot of wealth in Cyprus. There's a lot of land holdings in Cyprus. And I don't have any feeling that we know who they were and where they were, but maybe it's just my ignorance.
Well, I think I'm not really an expert on Cyprus, and I mean there are people who are much better informed than I am. I from what I know, well, you have uh, when Cyprus became Frankish, um, uh, there were landlords brought out from who'd been disinherited from lost their properties in the east and were given properties in Cyprus or given or
Yeah.
purchased properties in Cyprus. So you have this movement of landowners from the mainland to Cyprus. But to what extent you had settlers moving out? Certainly, I wouldn't expect they would be in very high numbers. I think probably most of the workforce would have been local Greek Christians, Eastern Christians in Cyprus rather than Franks. But I can't really say this with any expertise. It's not something that I've actually examined myself.
Yeah, but I'm saying we don't, as far as you know, there haven't been similar surveys of property records and exchanges and transfers of land for that initial period that when the Lusignans established their rule in Cyprus. Because I say we look at the Iblans, obviously have land in both. They have they must have huge estates. Montbéliard has estates in Cyprus that get in. Caesarea has huge estates in Cyprus, and they're having knights. They have knights' fees. They're taking knights with them when they go to fight in Syria from Cyprus, and they must be Frankish knights for the most part.
Yeah. So no, definitely. So yes, you would, but how extensive the Frankish settlement is beyond that, I wouldn't really know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not really not the person to ask. Let's put it that way. I mean, there are people who in Cyprus as well. There are scholars who are Nicholas Kourias, for example, people like that who would be able to better answer that than I am.
Thank you very much.
Okay, really interesting. So I think Montford's kind of a good example of, a military order site. Are there any castles or sites associated more with the secular organizations, like say just the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that you've found particularly interesting, Dr. Boas? And what can you tell us about some of those sites, maybe?
About castles that were not military order castles?
Yeah, like that were
secular.
Secular run, like perhaps run by the Kingdom of Jerusalem rather than being staffed by the Templars or the Teutonic Knights.
Well, there are many castles, so there are obviously castles that were, and I mean, it really depends on what you're meaning when you say castles, because they range from towers or tower keeps in isolated locations, which might belong to a local lord, and or church-owned towers in various places, and you get some large ones as well. But well, I'm not really certain what your question is, though.
We were just curious if you've excavated anything where you thought there was something worth sharing with us. I think.
Well, I think I mean all of my excavations I think have been on military order sites, and I'm trying to think now. I excavated in Bet Shan. Oh, there we are. That Bet Shan. It was a small tower surrounded by a water-filled moat, which is very unusual in the Latin East. Which was the first Crusader site that I actually directed an excavation on, and it's a feudal tower on top of a hill beside a village, a Frankish village. Of the Bessan family, so landowners in the area. So that was a Crusader castle, a lay Crusader castle. The other sites I've excavated are, I think, all military order. Vladimir is Templar Castle, Bet Ghibelline, not Bet Ghibelline. 1 second. Blanchard, which I didn't excavate. I had hoped to, but for political reasons, really, it wasn't possible. I don't know if you call them political reasons, but in any case, It wasn't possible to excavate, but we did do a survey there. At Ghibellin, Blanchard, sorry, is in the south. One of the castles built opposite Ascalon, to create a ring around Ascalon, and it's a small, very small castle, but it's surrounded by some more extensive earthworks. But we couldn't actually excavate, so we just surveyed it. But that's that's not a military order castle. So,
and there's absolutely nothing left of Ibelin itself, is there, Yavna?
well, I think there probably is, but it's underground. Nothing's been exposed. There's, you know, it's the excavations have been very limited there. A little bit on the church, and a few squares, but nothing very extensive. So I think often these sites where you think there's nothing there at all, there's quite a lot. For example, tomorrow I'm taking a group of students to a couple of castles around Jerusalem, Latrun, Torrent de Chevalier, Castello Arnaldi, which is right next door. Now, Latrun, on the surface, looks like nothing. I mean, there's an old Arab house there, and there's a couple of walls. But in fact, if you excavate it, it would be quite a substantial ruin. It was a very large castle. It was dismantled fairly late in, I think, the 17th, 18th century, mainly stone robbing for lime kilns, things like that. So, but it was quite a large structure, and underground you'll still have buried enough that if you excavated it, it would look like a monumental castle. You know, all of the foundations and walls standing to height of several meters, and the vaults and so forth. So you sometimes get this sense that there's nothing there, but once you start excavating, you find that there's quite a lot. Same thing in Suffolk, a very large castle, one of the largest castles in the Latin East, where on the surface you barely see anything, but there's a great deal there, and there are plans to excavate it. And
okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah, that'd be pretty interesting to know more about the castles that were, you know, placed around Ascalon. I guess that was during Fulk's reign or around that time, sort of to isolate it. So you're saying those have not been excavated very much at this point?
Well, one of them has, Ghibellin, which was the first one built by Fulk in 1134, and that was, or 36, I think it was, that was fairly extensively excavated and is now open as a national park, and it's quite an impressive site. It was a what we call quadriborgium. It's a sort of courtyard castle with projecting corner towers, and it was built on the ruins of earlier structures, so it's incorporated a lot of earlier remains within the building. And it's a particularly fascinating castle because it underwent very major changes as the political situation changed, as the security changed. So it was originally constructed as part of this ring, the first stage in a ring around Ascalon to prevent the attacks coming out from Ascalon in the first decades of the century. And then once Ascalon had been neutralized, it became the kernel of a rural settlement owned by the Hospitallers, and so it became more of an administrative center than a fortress. And in fact, when they built a church there for the parish church for the settlers, they stuck it right on against the castle, incorporating one of the towers of the castle. So it was virtually ruining the defensive effectiveness of the castle on its southern side by having this church built up against it, which meant that when this was done, they felt so secure that they could afford to do this. But then later on, all of a sudden, the whole thing is ringed around with a very impressive double walls. So once again, the threat had come back, and this, I assume, was when Salah ad-Din had begun to attack the kingdom from 1170 onwards, and they felt the need to refortify. And this refortification appears in a number of different places, particularly in the south of the kingdom. So you've got evidence of these changes, of how this original small castle underwent
these very different changes and eventually became a much larger castle.
Okay, interesting. So, what about the castles that were built by Baldwin the First really early on during his Red Sea campaign, like in the late 11 teens, I guess it was, so like Montreal? Do we have any? Has there been any excavation of those sites?
Not really. Showbach Montreal is a most of what you see there is Ayyubid, and there are two chapels, and there are some of the ring wall is Frankish. There's been a lot of study of the castle, but most of the excavation relates to the Ayyubid phases rather than the Crusader phases.
Okay. Well, this has just been a really interesting discussion, Dr. Boas. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with Helen and I about this.
My pleasure.
Yeah, did you have any final questions for Dr. Boas, Helena?
I would just, as a closing question, say, what if you could choose one thing or three things, whatever you find easier, what you think was archaeology has changed the historical perspective on most? Is there any one discovery, that, or the cumulative discovery, doesn't have to be a single thing so much, but where, and I'll step back on this just for a second. In other fields, I know that sometimes they find something archaeologically, and all of a sudden they have to revise all of their theories. It's happened with some of the things about Sparta and things in other places where there's more archaeological evidence that all of a sudden they say, "Oops, we were wrong." Have you been witness to any of those kinds of discoveries?
Well, I think there are a lot of archaeological discoveries that have, because so much has been ignored in the past, that almost anything you study in depth, for example, as I mentioned before, domestic architecture and so forth, these are new fields in this area. But I think for something that's made real getting an echo, a real change in how we understand. This is very good but awkward. I can hear myself double.
Oh, it'll probably go away in a second. Sometimes that happens with Google Hangouts.
Okay. Yeah.
Should we?
Anyway, I'll try to talk through this. I think the one area where archaeology has really changed the picture is with the rural settlements, because view in the past was that most of the Franks settled in the towns and the villages. And this has changed through the work of who did a very extensive Crusader sites. And I'm not entirely in agreement with all his conclusions, but it is quite clear today that rural settlement by Franks in the 12th century in particular was much more extensive than was understood in the past. So I think this is probably the main area in which archaeology, in this case surveys and a certain amount of excavations by people like Dennis Pringle from Britain, has changed the picture. So there's a lot of evidence today for a Frankish presence in the countryside, which wasn't apparent to the same extent in the past.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm sorry about that. Echo.
No, that's one of the hazards of Google Hangouts, unfortunately. But yeah, really interesting stuff. I've been looking forward to this discussion, and it was quite interesting. So, Helena, thanks for helping me out with this today.
No problem. My pleasure. Look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, and Dr. Boas, thanks so much for being with us. It was really fascinating, and I know we had about 40 or so people watching us live here, so everybody seems to have been enjoying it. So I'm glad we're able to get you on here to do this with us.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and I've got a link to Dr. Boas's blog down below on the feed here, so everybody can click on that and check it out. It's just adrianjboas.com, and really good stuff on there. I'm a regular reader of it. Basically, what seems to be the theme is a lot of good little insights into various aspects of Crusades history and archaeology. Is that kind of a fair assessment of sort of how you do your blog entries, Dr. Boas? It seems like a lot of the entries that they kind of have a personal touch attached to them, where you kind of relate it to some aspect of your life, and they're short reads, but they're very insightful as well. So yeah.
Well, basically the idea is to present something that's perhaps less central and more and to give it a twist, a little bit of humor, a little bit of personal touch, as you say, something relevant to make it as interesting as possible. I mean, there are so many topics that are fascinating topics that can be dealt with.
And I'd like to put in a plug for Dr. Boas's books, because I love his, as I say, domestic architecture. But there's also the one on Jerusalem itself, I believe.
That's right. Jerusalem in the time of the Crusades.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And I own them both, and they're worth having. Various scholars.
Yeah, I think that Dr. Boas's books give us something that we don't get in a lot of the other books on the Crusades, especially a lot of the basic histories. So very good stuff indeed. So yeah, thanks to everybody for listening with us live today, and to everybody who will be hearing this in the future on YouTube. And this has been the Real Crusades History live stream. We will talk to you later. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.